I often hear how the USA was founded on Christian values and morality, mainly from people who evidently have little education on the history of the USA, or more especially the day-to-day lives, desires, needs and expectations of the early settlers and founding fathers. It is all too easy to judge others by our own instilled and self-developed code of ethics and morality, without ever considering that the world-view of our ancestors was not the same as ours. I try to expend some effort to understand the mindsets of my forebears. When I look back in time and consider the inhumanity and immorality which pervades our history and is expressed so eloquently in the Bible, I pause to remember that their lives were not as ours are. That certain believers expend so much mental effort jumping through hoops to defend the indefensible in the Old Testament, when they could so easily accept that biblical morality is not their morality, often amuses me. But they have to stick by their fiction of an unchanging deity, rather than view history as it should be viewed, as an alien land where our laws and ethics do not apply. Even today I try to consider the expectations of people living in alien lands before I jump to conclusions over actions I read or hear about happening in what we might call less civilized parts of the world. And so I thought that I would try, in a small way, to illuminate the past. I've picked the 18th century, as that is the century of American independence, and I have picked the age of sail, as it was that which brought Europeans to the Americas and the Southern Oceans. It was also in the 18th century that Britain rose to its greatest power and truly ruled the waves. But I want to start right up to date with satellite navigation. Satellite navigation, or sat-nav, is now fairly ubiquitous. Even if you do not have one, there are times when you probably wished that you did. The ability to accurately locate our position, or our route to an intended destination, is something we all take for granted. All it takes for us to get to that business meeting is a few $1 billion worth of satellites, the application of Einstein's theories on relativity, some precious metals extracted out of African mines by slave child labour, and an annoying lady who has obviously never driven in busy traffic telling you that you have just missed your turn. The point being that we do not board a plane, embark on a ship, or even jump into our car and expect to arrive at our destination through a process of dead reckoning. But strip away road signs and familiar landmarks and I would suggest that you would struggle to reach any distant, unfamiliar destination. Until very recently in human history, there were no accurate maps and no way of determining our relative position on the Earth's surface. Dead reckoning was the method used to make long journeys. Unfortunately, when the great I Am designed his ultimate creation, he did not deem it necessary to build in any internal navigational system. Perhaps he'd run out after supplying all the lower order animals such as eels, turtles, salmon, birds and bees with the ability to efficiently travel far from home. Or perhaps he didn't want humans travelling too far from the garden, though that would not explain why the other creatures were allowed. Whatever his reason, he, or perhaps evolution, left us with nothing better than dead reckoning to find our way around. Dead reckoning is saying I have travelled at X speed for Y time, and have therefore travelled XY distance. So the villages that our ancestors visited were not really distances away, but a given time away. They visited people who lived 4 hours away or 2 days away, all determined by how fast they could walk, or how far they could walk in a given period of time. If they were in a position to own a horse or horse and cart, then their journeys were shorter, but travel time between cities many dozens of miles apart might still be measured in days rather than hours. Of course, distance is only one part of the story. Direction is the other. If you do not know what direction you are headed, then you can walk or ride forever and never reach your intended destination. Exploring by land is not such a problem under these conditions. You can draw maps and build up a picture of the world as you go. Those that follow on from you can use the rivers, hills and landmarks you have made note of to keep themselves on the right path. But the oceans are an altogether different prospect. There are no guiding marks. There is only ocean from horizon to horizon. You can use dead reckoning to estimate how far you have travelled by sea. Once it has been invented, you can use a compass, the accurate use of which depends on your knowledge of local magnetic declination, to reckon the direction in which you've been heading. but neither of these will be accurate enough to ensure you arrive at your intended destination. Throw in a few days and nights of stormy, overcast weather or a strong current, which make a mockery of your attempts at dead reckoning, and you might find yourself many miles off course and lost, your crew stricken with scurvy, or worse, your ship lost on a reef. The problem is longitude. Latitude is reasonably easy to measure accurately. The altitude of the sun at noon depends on your latitude. A sighting of the sun and a set of tables would tell you your latitude. But longitude is problematic. We all know that the sun rises, or appears to, at different times around the globe, and time is the key. The Earth rotates 360 degrees each day, or 15 degrees every hour. So if the sun rises an hour earlier or later where you are than it does when you're at home, you know that you are 15 degrees of longitude away from home. But to know it is rising an hour later or earlier requires that you have an accurate way of keeping time and knowing your local time relative to other places on Earth. And affordable accurate maritime timepieces were not available until around 1850. For a period between the 1760s and 1850, the method of lunar distances was used. The moon travels around the Earth and moves across the sky at the rate of about half a degree an hour. Whether you are in London or mid-Atlantic, you will see the moon in the same position in the sky relative to the stars at night or sun during the day at the same absolute time, allowing for parallax error. With tables and calculations, you can therefore determine the time in London regardless of your longitude. You can then use solar observations to determine local time and know then how many degrees you are west or east of London. Of course, the moon's position has to be well known and accurately tabulated, and the observations and calculations have to be carried out speedily and accurately, or you will still plot a position many miles from your real location. Hugging coastlines, keeping in sight of land, or simply following well-tried and tested routes left you prone to enemy and pirate attack, though often the difference between the two was difficult to determine, as in 1592 when the Portuguese Madre de Deus, Mother of God, was intercepted by the British off the Azores with a cargo valued at some £600,000, a sum equivalent to half of the British treasury, though by the time it had passed through the hands of the seamen and the dockyard at Plymouth, and despite the best efforts and threats of Walter Raleigh, only 150,000 reached the purse of Elizabeth I. The capture of such a prize, and especially the rich cargo of spices, drugs, silks, calicos, carpets, quilts, cloth, etc., all from the East Indies, stoked British interest and directly led to the 1600 formation of the East India Company. But back on tack and back to the 18th century. In 1707, dead reckoning was the way to go, with a bit of help from the stars, and if you got it wrong you could reckon on being dead. It was in this year, during the War of the Spanish Succession, that a British fleet ran aground off the Scilly Isles, with the loss of up to 2,000 men. You might not have heard of the War of the Spanish Succession. It was part of the seemingly interminable wars which racked Europe for decades, because the Catholic God and Protestant God could not get along with each other, and wanted anyone who suggested that they might do to be put to the sword. Anyway, during the 12-year to and fro of this particular conflict, the Admiral of the fleet, Sir Cloudesley Shovel, led a naval attack on the besieged French port of Toulon. Shovel was a British hero, mainly as a result of many years spent in the Mediterranean combating Barbary pirates. In the summer of 1707, an Austrian, British and Dutch force attempted to take Toulon by ground and sea. They failed in this, but did gain mastery of the Mediterranean by reducing the French fleet. Following this engagement, Shovel was ordered back to Portsmouth with his 15 ships of the line, plus a few lesser boats. The fleet sailed from Gibraltar about the 10th of October. The weather was overcast and stormy, and on the 21st of October, Shovel called the masters of all the ships to the Association, his flagship, to consult as to their actual location. The consensus was that they were at the latitude of Ushant, well off the coast of France, over 100 miles from the Scilly Isles. In the days of sails, Ushant and the Scillies were the southern and northern points of departure to the west from the English Channel. Apparently there was a dissenting voice who thought they were much closer to the Scillies, but Shovel went with the consensus. In actual fact, they were just off the Scilly Isles, and within a couple of hours of setting sail again, they found themselves amongst the rocks. The first ships to spot the rocks fired off warning shots, but it was too late for many of the sailors. The result of their miscalculation was that the Association, a second-rate 90-gun ship of the line, was lost with all hands, as many as 800 crew, including Admiral Shovel. Eagle, a third-rate 70-gun ship of the line, was lost with all hands. Romney, a fourth-rate 50-gun ship of the line, lost with one survivor. And Firebrand, a fireship, was lost with 28 of her 40-man crew. The survivors, as so often, thanked God for their deliverance, which does of course mean that they were thanking God for choosing to kill 2,000 people who were not them. It was this disaster which triggered the eventual passing of the 1714 Longitude Act, which established a board and a large prize to encourage a solution to the problem of longitude. Of course, knowing where you were at sea was not the only problem. Another and much bigger problem for long voyages was scurvy. Other diseases such as typhus, yellow fever and malaria took a very heavy toll, but scurvy was particularly prevalent in long sea voyages. The Annual Register of 1763 details the seamen and marines employed during the 7 Years' War at 184,893, of whom 1,512 died by enemy action or accidents, whilst 133,708 died of disease or were listed as missing. It has been estimated that between 1500 and 1800, scurvy killed at least 2 million sailors. Scurvy takes about 3 months without vitamin C to show serious effects. If you've read Bradford's History of the Plymouth Plantation, you will have read of the effects of scurvy on the God-fearing pilgrims. Of course, that half of the pilgrims who survived the trip and the first winter thanked God for killing the other half. But there you go. The effects of scurvy, and that some foods would help prevent it, had been known from ancient times, but the age of sail, with thousands of men being away from fresh food supplies for long periods of time, made it a pressing concern. It would be the 1930s before vitamin C, ascorbic acid named for its action in preventing scurvy, was isolated. Almost all animals and plants are able to synthesize vitamin C within their bodies. For some reason, God decided that a very few, including humans, should not be able to. Maybe he didn't want them to travel too far from that fruit tree in the garden, otherwise he might never entrap them to sin. Or perhaps evolution has a better explanation. The rodents which cannot synthesize vitamin C are closely related, and within the primate family, the lemurs, bush babies and lorises all have the ability to synthesize, whereas the tarsiers, monkeys and apes, including us, do not. Perhaps God had a really good reason for that, or perhaps evolution explains why the ability was lost at a logical branch in the evolutionary tree. In 1734, Johann Backstrom published his book on scurvy, in which he wrote, "Scurvy is solely owing to a total abstinence from fresh vegetable food and greens, which is alone the primary cause of the disease." Backstrom may have upset God by giving away his secrets, or perhaps he just annoyed the church, because he was apparently imprisoned and strangled to death by the Jesuits. Sailing on, and we reached the War of Jenkins Ear. Following the War of the Spanish Succession, the 1713 Treaty of Utrecht, or more correctly, Treaties of Utrecht, the peace treaties that ended the war, had signatories including Britain, the Dutch, France, Portugal, Spain and Savoy. Now, whilst the key element of the treaties was the continued separation of the French and Spanish crowns, Britain won Gibraltar and a monopoly on selling African slaves to the Spanish Americas, known as Asiento, together with chunks of Canada and Newfoundland. The Spanish also lost most of Italy and the Spanish Netherlands. Peace lasted for just 5 years until Spain decided it wanted Italy back and another try at the French throne. During the War of the Quadruple Alliance, 1718-1720, battle raged in Florida, Bermuda, Ireland and Europe. The anomaly of this war was that the French and British were on the same side for once. Between 1726 and 1729, the British attempted to blockade the Panama port of Puerto Bello with 11 ships of the line, failing miserably and losing some 3,000 to 4,000 men of the 4,750 crew to disease without a shot being fired. The Spanish in turn tried to retake Gibraltar. We just seemed incapable of getting along with them. In the Treaty of Seville, 1729, Britain agreed to allow the Spanish to board ships to ensure that Asiento was not being abused. We Brits then got belligerent and started flexing naval muscle, and revoked the right of Spaniards to board British ships, at which the Spanish revoked Asiento. It came to a head, or at least an ear, in 1731, when the Rebecca was boarded by the Spanish on suspicion of smuggling. The Rebecca's captain, Jenkins, was tied to the mast and his ear cut off. The offending captain allegedly stating, "Same will happen to him, the king, if he caught doing the same." The British response was immediate. Well, not exactly. Between 1732 and 1737, the British government supported the Spanish claims during the War of the Polish Succession. But relations soon soured, or returned to normal, and by 1738 we Brits needed an excuse for war again. In a piece of blatant, belated propaganda, Jenkins was dragged in front of Parliament with his now pickled appendage in a jar, and like Julius Caesar before him proclaimed, "Friends, Britons, countrymen, this is my ear." Well, maybe not quite. But this affront to the crown was laid beside other depredations of Spain, and together they were considered reason or excuse enough to go to war. Britain launched its fleet and had its first success back in Panama. Puerto Bello was a Spanish silver exporting port, and the British Admiral Vernon took and ransacked it in November 1739. This small victory was held back in Britain far beyond its merit. The public had been whipped into an anti-Spanish frenzy. Rule Britannia was written, and the victory is also commemorated to this day in Portobello Road, London, and Portobello, Edinburgh, amongst other place names. In Britain, as elsewhere, we are taught about and celebrate our great victories. There are few large towns which do not boast a Waterloo Road. At the centre of our capital is Trafalgar Square, and the only palace in England not owned by the Crown or God was built to celebrate victory at the Battle of Blenheim, one of the turning points of the War of the Spanish Succession, and to reward the victor of that battle, the Duke of Marlborough, one John Churchill. So, like citizens of all countries, we are indoctrinated from birth by our great successes, whilst some of our greatest military defeats warrant nary a mention. For instance, there are no place names in Britain commemorating the Battle of Cartagena. There might have been. Cartagena was another of the 4 big silver exporting ports for the Spanish. In 1741, Vernon dispatched a message back to Britain to inform the king of his victory at Cartagena. The forts protecting the port had fallen in quick time, and Vernon was assured of success. Indeed, medals were struck back in Britain, some of which still survive. Unfortunately, by the time King George back in England was being informed of the victory, the battle in Central America had all gone peak-tong. In the Battle of Cartagena, the British pitted 186 ships and 12,000 land troops against a one-eyed, one-armed, one-legged Spanish admiral with around 4,000 troops, and were spectacularly defeated. Vernon lost 50 ships and 18,000 men, disease again being the prime cause of defeat, along with atrocious planning and execution. The loss of such a fleet and army was big news back in Europe. It emboldened the continental powers and resulted in the War of Austrian Succession, yet another belter which time precludes expansion on. You will note a common theme. Far from the Hollywood portrayal of fit, efficient, well-disciplined sailors manning their guns to the last and engaging in great feats of derring-do, the reality was disease-racked ships with men falling like flies, and surviving officers struggling to muster enough hands to rig the sails or man the guns. These journeys and battles at sea were truly wars of attrition. Nowhere is this more evident than in Admiral George Anson's celebrated round-the-world voyage of 1740 to 1744, from which only 188 of the 1,854 who left England returned home. And it is to that journey I turn next time, as I read from Anson's own report of the trip. Thank you, as always, for watching.